Just mention the words carbon tax and watch temperatures rise on both sides of the debate. The federal government thinks it's the cat's meow, while a number of provinces believe it's the mark of the beast. We're going to wade into it a little bit further with Robert Murphy, who is a senior fellow with the Fraser Institute and has a doctorate in economics. Robert has written a paper called Carbon Pricing in Alberta. Bob, welcome to Bridge City News.
Thanks for having me, Hal. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, can you first of all explain to our viewers how a carbon tax is supposed to work theoretically?
Well, sure. So the idea, of course, is that there's problems that come from emission of greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide in particular, that the market economy is not taking into account. So when people decide how much gasoline to buy, what kind of car to buy, they're not taking into account, so the theory goes, their actions on the rest of humanity through the mechanism of climate change. So a carbon tax, if it's correctly calibrated, the idea is that that will give people the negative feedback they need in order to make the socially correct decisions, taking everything into account. So that's the textbook theory of what a carbon tax is supposed to do in this context.
In theory, then, carbon-emitting businesses will find ways to reduce carbon output in order to pay less in carbon taxes, which will hopefully reduce their carbon footprint?
Yeah, that's exactly right, Hal. So that's the theory. And the reason some economists think a carbon tax is the best way to deal with the problem of climate change is that the government's not ordering businesses to cut back in a certain way. It's not telling which particular companies how much they need to cut back. It's just putting a, quote, price on carbon and then letting everybody adjust, just like in the normal market. If oil gets more expensive, you just let people respond to the price accordingly, and each person can cut back the way he or she thinks is appropriate for their household or business. So you're right. The idea of this is like it's supposed to be like a decentralized mechanism. But again, they're saying we need to put this tax in place because the market's not taking into account climate change.
Now, you say there's something happening they'll refer to as leakage. What is that all about?
Sure. So the problem here, and what the study was really getting at, is to say that whether you think that a carbon tax is a good approach to dealing with climate change or not, it really doesn't make sense to do it just at the provincial level. So that was, I think, one of the main points of the study. And the specific problem, as you say, Hale, is this thing called leakage. And so the idea here is, let me just exaggerate it just so you get the point. Imagine the Alberta government just put in place a really draconian carbon tax, like thousands of dollars a ton, and they enforced it, very, very strictly. So what would happen over time is just all the businesses and households would just move out of Alberta and they would go to other jurisdictions. And so that's what's meant by leakage. In other words, the emissions aren't really stopped. They just leak elsewhere to other jurisdictions. So global emissions wouldn't actually go down that much. Alberta emissions might go way down in that scenario I just described, but they would just go up elsewhere. And so if the point is to minimize global climate change, just displacing emissions out of the province of Alberta elsewhere obviously just means Alberta suffers economically, and it doesn't even do that much to address climate change. So that problem of leakage is bigger the smaller the jurisdiction. So even at the federal level, you'd have it, but it's really pronounced at like the provincial level.
Now, part of the problem seems to be that if we spend all of this money to reduce emissions, but our economic competitors and other nations are not, then do we really remain competitive? Many of those countries like China and India producing far more emissions than we are. Are we really making much of a difference, Bob?
Well, you're exactly right, Hal, and that's just another way of seeing this problem of leakage. So again, yes, if the Alberta policymakers, if they think, oh, we want to do our part, and they really ramp up taxes and other mandates and penalties on emissions, they could reduce emissions in Alberta, and that, of course, makes electricity more expensive, gasoline more expensive for people living in Alberta. But you're right, that doesn't do that much to fight the global problem of climate change because other countries, governments, they're not cracking down nearly as much. And what's really perverse is if a particular manufacturing operation, let's say, moves out of Canada and goes to China, well, in general, to produce the same amount of goods, they're going to emit more tons of CO2 just because the techniques they use over there happen to be less efficient in terms of emissions. And so you could get a perverse result where in certain cases it might actually increase emissions even though the local jurisdiction in Canada thinks they're, quote, doing the right thing.
Now, in the 2018-2019 fiscal, Alberta's carbon levy is expected to raise $1.4 billion. That money is coming from business owners and consumers, with a further scheduled increase to $50 per ton in 2022. That'll increase the burden of the carbon tax on businesses and households. So how are the governments using the tax revenue coming in from this?
So the CLP, the Climate Leadership Plan, it's using the revenue in three main ways. So these are rough figures, of course, but about a third of it's going to try to reduce other types of taxes. Another third's going for rebates, and another third is devoted to what we could call green energy projects, things to try to get businesses to convert over to alternative energies, things like that. And so the problem is though that even on its own terms, this is one of the things that we get across in the study. If you are going to have a carbon tax, then what you want to do is just refund the money to citizens, and you don't want to have the government spend it on other programs. In other words, that's redundant. The whole point of the carbon tax is to decentralize the cutbacks, not to have the government on top of that then give mandates or to subsidize wind and solar and things like that. Because again, that's defeating the whole purpose.
So are the green energy projects funded by the carbon tax creating jobs and helping to stimulate the economy?
Well, they certainly create jobs in the sectors that are receiving the money, but then on the flip side, the areas that are being taxed are seeing job shrinkage. Okay, so I wouldn't say that the government's not creating jobs on net, especially in the long run, if they levy a tax on some sectors of the economy and then subsidize other ones.
Now, with all of the money which is being collected, how much of a dent are we really putting into climate change?
Again, here we come back to the problem that you face trying to address it at the Canadian level, let alone at the level of Alberta. So Canada by itself, the figures I checked, it's something like 1.6 or 1.5% of total global emissions. And so, of course, Alberta, just the province, their emissions are obviously even smaller than that. And so, in the grand scheme, and it's even worse in terms of if you ask, okay, from now through, let's say, the year 2100, if things progress the way people project, what percentage of those new emissions going forward is going to be accounted for by businesses in Canada or even in Alberta, let alone? Obviously, it's going to be a very minuscule thing. So even if Canada tomorrow went to zero emissions, in the grand scheme, that wouldn't make much of a difference, let alone the small changes that are coming in place from modest carbon taxes. So the quick answer to your question is it's causing a lot of economic pain without very much to show for it, just because, again, Canada is such a small player and this problem of leakage.
Yeah, where's the return on investment here, right? The Alberta Climate Leadership Plan does have quarterly rebates to residents who qualify with lower incomes. How effective has that approach really been?
Okay, so here again, you have a trade-off. So obviously, part of the problem or the cost, if you will, of a carbon tax is it makes electricity and transportation more expensive, and that's going to tend to burden lower income people the most, right? If electricity gets 20% more expensive, poor households suffer more than rich ones do, obviously. And so I applaud the motivation to say, hey, let's take some of this incoming revenue and give it as rebates to poorer households. So that certainly makes sense. But the problem is in terms of economic efficiency, that's what you want to do is to reduce the taxes elsewhere in order to stimulate growth. And so just giving people lump sum checks, that doesn't give them the incentive to work more or to save more. And so that's one of the problems. That if you are going to use revenue to reduce the burden on the citizens, just giving them fixed checks, that's actually the least efficient way to do it.
So, Bob, your study shows that it would be better economically if Alberta simply reduced corporate income tax rates by the amount of carbon tax revenue coming in. Can you explain that?
Sure. So there again, this is standard results in the literature that a lot of the people who are for a carbon tax, if the critics will say, well, gee, won't this hurt the economy? And they'll say, oh, well, no, if we do it right, if we take the revenues and we reduce corporate income taxes, then maybe the economy can continue to grow and we won't slow economic growth. And so my point is there's not enough money to go around. That yes, the way you can make it so the economy doesn't slow too much is to use the new carbon tax revenues to cut the most damaging of other taxes, namely like the corporate income tax and other income taxes. So that if all you wanted to do was to not have GDP growth slow, you could do that. But then that means there's no money left over to help poor households who are struggling with higher energy prices. But if you try to use the money to help the poor households, then there's not money left to do the corporate income tax cuts. So the point is you're going to have to choose who's going to get hurt. And either way, bad things happen if you impose a new carbon tax. And I think that, the proponents need to admit that.
So, if Alberta and Canada continue to have a tax on carbon, your paper suggests it would be better to apply the tax right across Alberta, not just to carbon emitters. And would this do less damage to the economy?
Well, I think maybe what you read in the part of the study there is, well, what I was saying in the conclusion is I was trying to give recommendations to policymakers, and what I was saying is, one thing would just be to get rid of the Alberta carbon tax altogether, but especially in the context of if the federal government is going to have a standard, a baseline, and say that the provinces need to have a level of this much, that it would be silly for Alberta to have it above that level, right? So in other words, there's no reason for Alberta to have a carbon tax higher than what's being applied in the other provinces, because again, you get this problem of leakage. In the grand scheme, that's not going to do anything except punish Alberta businesses.
You know, we've got the provincial election coming up here in Alberta this spring. We've got the federal election in October, and Justin Trudeau and the Liberals are in a bit of disarray right now with the SNC-Lavalin affair. If we see changes in government, provincially and federally, will we likely say goodbye to the carbon tax?
Well, again, it's hard to predict the politics, and so I was mostly focusing on the economics. But you're right. I think some people, there's an argument to say, hey, let's have the the province of Alberta impose our own carbon tax, because then under the current structure, we at least get a say in how the revenues are used. Whereas if the feds come in and do it, they're going to be the ones in control of the rebate. But what you're talking about, I think, is a school of thought from the other side saying it would be silly for us to go ahead and get the machinery up and tax everyone in Alberta if at the federal level all that goes away, because the country's mood changes and there's different electoral outcomes. And so it would be, again, what really would make no sense is if Alberta has a real stiff carbon tax and then the rest of Canada, it's in patches, because that does nothing. It just means certain provinces are getting hit with these arbitrarily high energy prices and businesses go elsewhere. So global emissions aren't really affected that much.
I talked to a lot of small business owners, Bob, that run their businesses across southwestern Alberta, and they've been hit hard by the carbon tax since the NDP brought it in, with the Trudeau Liberals here. So how are businesses really going to adjust, and what impact will it have on the economy if all of a sudden there is no carbon tax? Just more money in their pockets, they can hire more people, stimulate the economy?
Sure. And so here, again, I want to remind people the whole reason we're having this discussion, the reason that businesses use electricity right now that's produced partly from fossil fuel sources, the reason so many vehicles rely on conventional gasoline, is that that's cheaper and more effective, more convenient than strictly renewable or zero emission energy sources. So if the government through taxing and mandates is going to force businesses and households to switch, that has a cost. So going the other way, if you get rid of that tax and get rid of those mandates, then that means there's more real resources available to increase production. So the way you would see that is, yes, they would have more income left over. They would hire more. There'd be faster job growth. That's what you would see. But ultimately, it's just saying letting people create electricity and transportation in the most economically sensible fashion. That's what happens when the government sort of keeps its hands off and lets people make their own decisions.
Robert Murphy is a senior fellow with the Fraser Institute. Thanks a lot for your time today.
Thanks for having me, Hal.